Sure, Will, and yeah, well, thanks again to you and Sarah for putting together a fantastic series of talks. Um, and I think I've been really fortunate over the last sort of 20, 30 years of sort of working across across the sort of East African region to, as more and more sites have become available, we've really been able to sort of move away from a much more sort of descriptive framework, which was certainly the case for sort of paleoecology in this part of the world when I joined. Go to a site, take a core, analyze changes, pollen, charcoal, and describe those changes. And I think as more and more dots have appeared on the landscape, we can really start to move from a sort of descriptive to a much more interpretive framework and resonate with the things like Esther was just talking about. We've heard from Estelle earlier on. And as we heard from Rahab, also working with different communities. So that's the combination between archaeologists and paleoecologists. And that, I guess, enables us to start to think about the future. Obviously, that whole tenet of paleoecology of the past being the key to the present and key to the future. But I think increasingly, as we have more of these sites across the landscapes, more proxies, better dating control, more resolved age depth models, I think that value of paleoecological data, and obviously that's at the heart of what Eric was able to instill in this community, is starting to be realised. And I really do feel as though that start is only just starting. And clearly there are lots of challenges ahead, particularly around water, energy, biodiversity losses, climate change, habitat land use, particularly across this part of the world, environmental governance and some of the challenges around governance. And I'll pick up on some of those issues and really maybe sort of make the link between what the data that we've been able to generate and how that's helped us maybe start to move to that sort of interpretive landscape. So, the East African region is Lake Victoria here, bang in the centre, with a couple of nice records, and clearly these large rift lakes have been a little bit of an early focus. But increasingly we see a large number of sites, and it's the sort of paleo sites here in the little yellow triangles, and the archaeological sites in the red dots start to be pulled together. And there's been lots of initiatives. Anne-Marie mentioned Biome 6000. That's maybe one of the first sort of large-scale collaborative synthetic program that brought together lots of these data. And I know a number of us across the community are working with things like the Land Cover 6K or Traces. There are numerous synthetic programs out there at the moment, which again, I think is really starting to show the value of data. And obviously for that value to be realized, they have to be in a database and archivable and retrievable and able to be analyzed. And again, it's real testament to Eric and all of the people who worked on pollen databases, generating tools to allow that interpretation to take place, that we can really start to use and retrieve these data. So these are all sort of sites where I or people I've worked with, like Esther and Gemma and Colin and Rahab. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of sites, and clearly Esther and I didn't discuss what we were going to talk about, because I'm also going to talk a little bit about Ambercelli. But again, I think it just shows the benefit of having a number of sites and working in a particular region for a number of years, that you can really start to move from that descriptive to the more interpretive framework. So zooming in, that sort of area across the sort of Kenya to the north, Tanzania and sort of borderland here. And this is just a sort of MODIS image showing the land cover, the contemporary land cover. In pink is agriculture. And we can see that sort of tide of agriculture abutting these sort of world famous protected areas like Serengeti and Ngorongoro, Amboseli up here. And clearly land use and land use transformation is increasingly pervasive. As populations grow, as climates change, as nations develop and agricultural technologies develop, irrigation technologies. And this is really I think one of the challenges for the future. And again, paleo and paleo data have a real role to play in understanding these transformations. So we're going to focus initially on Amboseli, and we've already seen some of the great records that can be retrieved from the sites. It's particularly good in terms of paleoecology because of the sort of sedimentary archives in these swamps. These swamps are fed by the groundwaters, ultimately coming off the slopes of nearby Kilimanjaro, just to the south here. And these are what the landscape looks like. I mean, we've clearly seen a little bit about it from Esther's talk, but just focusing on the swamps here. This is a swamp within the national park, so within the protected area. Often it's a place where animals will congregate, particularly during drought periods. And one of the climate future signals of this part of the world is that climates are becoming more variable. Drought intensity, frequency is increasing. And certainly these swamps, can often be a lifeline to maintain the animals during droughts. I remember during 2009, 2010, there was a very severe drought. Up to 70–80% of the wildlife died. The carnivores did very well, as you can imagine, lots of very slow moving, very lethargic prey animals. But once that prey had been diminished, they then led to a whole series of intense conflicts with the remaining cattle from the Maasai population that live around these parts, particularly goats and cattle. And Kenya Wildlife Service had to sort of ship in zebra at quite great expense, several $1 million spent on buying zebras to restock these parks. So again, these swamps have an incredible value in maintaining that wildlife, in maintaining that tourist industry. This is a swamp about 20 kilometers away near Kamana that we've just heard about from Esther, completely transformed, largely drained, converted to agriculture. One of the big challenges ahead is, I guess, these sort of land use transformations, and we saw that from that satellite image right at the beginning. And certainly those land use transformations, particularly outside of the protected areas, are increasingly impinging and impacting on how effective that protected area can be in terms of its ability to preserve and maintain wildlife, and importantly for animals to move between wildlife areas. So Esther showed this diagram. This was a result of 5 records that Esther mentioned. Initially some that I produced, then Stephen Racina from National Museums in Kenya, and then Esther, and obviously with Colin Courtney Mustafi doing the sort of charcoal analyses and producing this graphic. And again, sort of moving away from pollen diagrams to a more pictorial cartoon way of presenting our ecosystem changes. And I think that's quite important, particularly if we do want to engage with other communities. making the data accessible, making our insights accessible. Yes, behind these are, stratigraphic Tilia-based C2 type diagrams, but ultimately, if we want to convey ecosystem change, interactions with human populations, interactions with fire and climate, we have to be able to think about presenting these data in a better way. And these types of examples, I think, show quite nicely some of the major changes which have occurred. Just pulling up another record nearby, a record that's produced by Gemma Finch. So this is from the northern part of the Eastern Arc Mountains. So this is probably the hottest of the global biodiversity hotspots, more species per unit area and a more threat than anywhere else in the world. And again, just thinking about that connection with some of those contemporary issues around biodiversity loss and some of the drivers behind that. And Gemma was able to produce a really nice record, again, that Colin helped out in doing some of the analysis on the charcoal. And again, we can see that the ecosystem has transformed immeasurably, particularly in the last 600 to 700 years. And clearly that starts to link into that sort of Anthropocene, those human drivers of landscape change. And that driver of change was nothing compared to what happened around the 1800s as we started to get maize arriving in the landscape. And particularly the rapid transformations that these sort of new crops have imparted at the landscape level. And that is a very somewhat complicated relationship. That arrival of maize links into pre-colonial ivory trade, massive removal of elephants from the landscape. Again, we don't know how many elephants there were in East Africa. I've seen estimates up to around about 20 million. Today there's about 200,000, just to provide a bit of context.
Couple of minutes, Rob.
Okay, so I'll just rattle through the last ones. Yeah, so one of the things that we're really adamant in working on is making that link between our past insights and the future challenges. And obviously we know those challenges around climate change, but making climate change futures that are bespoke for the context. So particularly moving away from temperate views of temperature change to precipitation views. So here you can see changes in precipitation across Africa, particularly changes in carbon dioxide and water fire interactions. I just mentioned around elephants and how important these ecosystem engineers are in transforming landscapes. Again, we can see here a plot within Amboseli. This plot was about 7 years in existence, where you can go from grassland to quite dense acacia woodland. And that's something which we see more broadly across the landscape. In terms of those landscape issues, we're very much working with communities, having those conversations right from the beginning, developing these so-called participatory scenarios where we present our data, we present our insights, and chart land use change. So here we have land use change across Tanzania, looking at changes in biodiversity, water, carbon. And we do that at different scales. So at national scales, looking at then impacts of, say, developments like the SGR. And my last slide is back to Amboseli and a little bit of a good news story, again, back to the swamps. When I made this particular slide, it was for a talk about 3 months ago at the British Ecological Society around climate change and conservation issues. And at that time, the elephant corridors that connect Amboseli to the nearby park of Savo through these areas was becoming increasingly closed by an avocado farm. and effectively that migration corridor was blocked. So very much the balance was tipped in the favour of the avocado farms. Just yesterday, I heard that NEMA, the Natural Environmental Management Authority in Kenya, have put a stop notice on that agricultural practice, that large landscape transformation to maintain space for these very important ecosystem engineers. Not directly linked to paleo, but certainly paleo data and the long-term insights contributing to this knowledge about landscape transformations, which is crucial for contemporary decisions like migration corridors, dealing with future climate change. Sorry, I've overrun a little bit, but that's the end.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was great and really nice to finish on a good news story.
Yeah.
We often talk a lot about getting our work into policy and affecting it, but actually having tangible evidence or even intangible evidence where it's having an influence is hard to pin down very often. So nice to have an example of where the influence is.